Hello everybody, I'm excited to be part of the Zoom tradition that has started in EA, yeah, I'm excited about it. I've actually gotten to see some of them and glad to contribute to the conversation. And so I think I'll just jump right in to the talk, and I think I will make a point of opening up for questions as desired. So maybe I'll just stay with what material I have and then have some time towards the end, and I'll end right at the hour-long point necessarily on my end. This is kind of an evolving contribution to the EA conversation for me. I've talked about it in different ways a couple of years ago in Norwalk and other places. And the starting point for me with most of my work with astrology is myth. That was my personal starting point. And so, but what I'm looking at is the myth of the constellations that we associate with the signs. And I think most of us as astrologers haven't really learned these stories, at least not in detail. And what I love about these for EA astrology for us is that a lot of times the myth really speaks to some of the distinctions that we in EA make about the signs that are not maybe as widely were looked at in the larger astrology community. So, for instance, the Pisces myth speaks very deeply to the archetype of sadism, which you don't really see a lot outside of the EA community. But the myth itself is very deeply resonant with that. And this one, Aquarius, is likewise. So I think I'll just jump into the myth. And so I'm going to click this and find out if it's doing what it should do. Yeah. So the myth of Aquarius in the Greek tradition, and of course there are many myths from many different traditions, but we'll run with the Greek since that most directly influenced astrology for us with the Romans. It's the story of Ganymede, and specifically the abduction of Ganymede. So Ganymede was this very beautiful prince of Troy. We're about 3 generations prior to the Trojan War here. Innocence of the self disincarnate, giving it over to the gods. You could say another way to say it is that there's the disincarnate extraordinary and the incarnate ordinary. So someone with really a lot of trauma, for instance, might show up a lot in Tros, in the Saturn place, like they're sort of shut down, going through life, making it work, but the vitality has been somehow sequestered away. It's been split off. And so I think to get a little more into this, I want to bring in the Leo-Aquarius polarity. These are, words that will be familiar. And there may be a couple that maybe people wouldn't associate, but I think most of this will make a lot of sense to the EA community. So whereas Leo is often seen as participant, Aquarius objectifies and backs up and observes. Heart and brain are important ones here. That the heart and the brain have very different electrical and electromagnetic signatures, right? The heart is highly cohering. And its signals are actually, coordinated to the resonance of the earth, like the Schumann frequency and that sort of stuff. The brain is a much more random process, right? It's much more electrical, its magnetic processes are harder to follow. So then too, magnetism is associated to the heart, to Sun, Leo, electricity to Aquarius and Uranus, the discovery of electricity during the Uranian century, the 18th century with Franklin and all the revolutions. Leo, coherence, and Aquarius, interruption, very important word for Aquarius. Anything with the word rupt in it is good for Aquarius, right? Eruption, interruption, disruption, rupture, all of that is Aquarian. Whereas Leo has a centering energy. I mean, you think about the sun itself, it is what coheres the solar system, right? And we think of it often as the purposeful quality of the soul, that has a sort of unifying, cohering function that keeps things, the sun keeps the planets in orbit. Whereas Aquarius and Uranus decenter things, right? Aquarius, when Uranus arrived on the scene as a planet in 1762, it interrupts the entire notion of how the spheres are. That Saturn sat there thinking he's the end of all, and then Uranus shows up, trickster, and says, guess what? There's a whole other world out here. Creation, deconstruction. That Leo, of course, is a life source, an expressive source, and Aquarius takes stuff apart. Appearance and disappearance are also there. Like Leo appears on the stage, and Leo is often the actor, Aquarius is the audience, right? Unity and multiplicity. This is also important when we're thinking of trauma, because something about trauma is that it interrupts. We have trouble with reconciling the fact that as the psyche is both a unified experience and a multiplicitous experience, right? Like on the one hand, we have a constant sense of an I, that has happened through the individuation of the soul from spirit and the individuation of the ego from soul. So there is an I. Like if you think back to when you were 2 or 3, you are still the same I in a sense, and yet you're also not. And there are all these other aspects of self. Think about, for instance, also the sun. When the sun is up, all you see is the sun. It's just one sun. It's unity. There's one thing. But when the sun goes down, suddenly there's all this multiplicity revealed in the sky, right? Planets, stars, all of it. The sun doesn't let you see that. So there's some dialectic here between a unified sense of the self and a multiplicitous sense of the self, when we need both, right? Otherwise, if it's all multiplicity, we lose track. It just has randomness. So fusing and splitting, you can see, go along with that. And then I also mentioned the time sense again, that Leo has this quality of total now. And Aquarius, of course, is always looking to past and future, right? Aquarius interrupts linear time, spatializes time so that you can travel in time through Aquarius, which trauma survivors actually travel in time involuntarily when they have flashbacks and experiences like that, or even flash forwards. There's a time travel that opens up, right? The field of time, the now, is moved out, and Aquarius often is looking to the past or the future, often in idealized ways, one way or the other. A lot of times they think they're looking to the future, but they're actually going to the past. Like they self-styled revolutionaries, but you can kind of see it's all about the past. At any rate, there's a disruption in the time continuum. So some of that just to kind of open up the Aquarius piece a little more. So then this is about trauma. But the first slide here, this one about the growth cycle, rupture, and repair, this to me would be the Leo-Aquarius cycle working well, working in a way that can allow both that experience of staying the same while changing that I put there on the bottom. That's a statement from Philip Bromberg, who writes a lot about the multiplicity of the psyche. And so how do you do that? How do you stay the same while changing? Well, the one there talks about a stable egoic system. And so this is where we have to think about Cancer-Capricorn axis, right? Structure of consciousness in Capricorn, ego structure in Cancer. These are mutually provide a kind of container for psychic contents for the soul in this lifetime. The ego is a sort of containing vessel that is used to get through life. It's an interface process. And then the Sun Leo piece sort of coheres things in the psyche around that. So all the multiplicitous implicit field is cohered through the sun. And so in other words, there's the conscious knowledge of this is who I am in Cancer Capricorn, particularly Cancer, but you need Capricorn's sense of history and structure to do the Cancer in. And then around, the Leo piece helps to cohere all the unconscious material around that in a workable way. So assuming that's in place, which is step one, which is quite an accomplishment, quite an achievement, and we need other people absolutely to do it, right? Cancer, Capricorn, mother, father, family, society. We absolutely cannot create an effective ego without interpersonal process. You have to be here on Earth. You have to get some attunement and some understanding and Otherwise, you don't have a vessel, and this is just going to be a complete disaster. But we'll say you have a vessel, you got lucky, somebody saw you at some point, and, you know, good thing. Some human. It is not going to be enough to be seen by something metaphysical or a god or a spiritual figure or an ancestor. That's insufficient for the development of an ego. It has to be human and in flesh. That's what I would offer at any rate. And I think that's what the astrology says. So great, you got that going. But of course it's limited, and, you know, life wants to evolve. And so Uranus comes in, step 2 there, introduces something that triggers this material that's beyond the current configuration that you've got in place. In other words, it opens you to something that's further out, and it ruptures you to some extent, right? This doesn't have to be overwhelm. And in this little circle, it's not really overwhelm, but it is definitely rupture, right? Something like you're opened up by a life experience. There's some collision with you, usually an interpersonal collision, but not always. That then in step 3 there disrupts the coherence, right? It actually throws off the coherence. And the implicit field, like all that other stuff, is activated. What was invisible, the multiplicity, right? It's like the sun sets briefly and you see all this stuff, or at least something becomes visible and flows in, interrupts. And then hopefully, though, we have that dialectic back over here to the sun Leo again, where that newly discovered material can actually be recohered, and my sense of self has expanded. My capacity to hold my full experience is larger, and I can incorporate this new thing, right? And again, that's going to all depend partly on the Cancer Capricorn piece. That's something I want to develop more at some point, is that, you know, you really have to have that before this can even happen. And this is very much a notion, as we have in EA, that to do something like go from Cancer to Capricorn or to Leo, you have to go kind of Cancer, Capricorn, Leo, Aquarius, Virgo. You know, you keep going around like that. You can't just go in the straight circle. When you do it that way, you're skipping, well, you're probably creating skip steps for yourself, honestly, but you're certainly not incorporating the polarity, and you're going to have a less than whole experience of the next archetype. So, but if we have Cancer and Capricorn in there, right, where Cancer, we're developing that ego structure, Capricorn, we are developing a certain self-sufficiency, which lets us then cohere in Leo, which then gives us space to let the interruptions of Aquarius in, right? And then we go back to, you know, we have that dialectic. So this is kind of this is great when it works this way, and it often does. However, there's traumatic experiences. And let me just say a couple of things about trauma. A few things. One is trauma is not the event, right? It's not the event that is the trauma. Two people can experience the exact same event, and one is traumatized and one isn't. It is the experience of the event. It's how did you experience the event? And this is why, for instance, when people come in and say, well, I've never had, to me as a therapist, and say, nothing really that bad's ever happened. You know, there hasn't been abuse or at least not overt abuse. I mean, everybody's been covertly abused, God knows. But overtly, no, nothing happened. You know, I wasn't, you know, sexually assaulted, whatever. So I don't really know why I'm so fucked up. It's kind of the beginning of that conversation. And but what we don't realize is it's not really about the intensity of the event officially or objectively, as if there was any such thing anyway. It's how you experience it. What did it bring up in you? And here we are talking about the nonlinear implicit field, right? Like all these things that you need second sight to see. And I don't mean psychic sight, but I do mean psychological sight. So emotions, sensations, thoughts, imagery, action urges, right? Like I wanted to get away, or I wanted to fight back. I felt scared. I felt weird, you know, tingly things in my body. I saw like demonic images, you know, whatever that is, it's that experience. And if that experience is enough to overwhelm your existing psychic resources, so to overwhelm your Cancer Leo stuff you've built through Cancer Leo, right? That ego structure and that coherence. If what comes in there is kind of too big, and it exceeds your capacity, and you don't have someone else around you holding you through that, then we have a trauma. Okay, so it's exceeding your intrapsychic capacities, but I should also have written there that it's also exceeding your the resources externally that might be available. So for in other words, like if you're bullied at school, but you have a parent that you can go home to and help to sort of make sense of that and feel your feelings and cathartic your feelings and sort of figure out a way to get through it and not be overwhelmed by it or to end it, whatever. Maybe you kick and scream a little, which is probably a useful thing. Then it's probably not going to become a trauma because it hasn't exceeded your intrapsychic capacities or your interpersonal resources to integrate it and make sense of it, right? And here also we could say not only your interpersonal resources, but also if you are open to the numinous and the archetypal realm. So similarly, if you have, even as a child, a relationship with a divine figure, that might be enough to help you integrate and make sense of it, right? Like if Mother Mary is coming to you at times, or even another incarnation of yourself is coming to you and ministering to that need, then you might be able to integrate it also. But a trauma is when it's past your capacity to integrate. And at that point, we're in trauma and we're out of remembering and we're into dismembering, right? So we're into splitting off that which you couldn't contain. And that's dissociation. The psyche is in shock. You can see the first two steps here are the same. You have the system, you have Uranus bringing some stuff, but in this case, it's too big, so the coherence is disrupted, but then instead of being able to reintegrate it, we go down into the environment is unreceptive to incarnating the newly discovered aspects of self. So what I mean by that is there's not room for me to have my experience in the world the way I'm having it. And so this is why you definitely don't have to have an event, right? If you have a developmental trauma where there's nothing that happened per se, but nobody ever got you, saw you, attuned to you, then you have to look at that as trauma too. So I can't bring it together with my own intrapsychic resources or that relational context. So then my only option left, besides psychosis, is to split off the things that I couldn't integrate. So what that could look like is splitting everything about it, right? You could split off the images, you could split off the thoughts you had, the emotions, the body sensations. You could split off all of that is possibly split off. And often it's split into different places. So for instance, maybe I can tell the story of what happened, but I can't feel it in my body. I can't really go there emotionally. Or maybe I can see the images, like I'll have flashbacks, but I can't narrate it. I can't put words on it. Or maybe I just get overwhelmed by weird body sensations and I've never really known why, right? So all of this is this dismemberment, this splitting that happens when we are dealing with Uranian Aquarian process, that when it's not mediated through those earlier archetypes. So when we don't have that, this is what we do, and this is often called a freeze response, right? So in other words, you sort of freeze it and send it off to the Siberia of your consciousness, right? You sort of just like, get rid of it. I don't want to deal with it. And, then you're setting yourself up. You're going to have to thaw out eventually and incorporate it. Maybe this lifetime, maybe another. But it's split off. So I have to see what I have here next. That's good, but we'll come back. So Aquarius and post-traumatic process. So if you see charts with a lot of Aquarian signatures or there are Uranus transits coming through, these are some of the things that can happen. So disembodiment and disidentification with the body, right? So this is where you ask somebody what they feel in their body, they have no clue. They're not very grounded. They maybe don't even feel their body, right? They've done the Ganymede thing, right? They've gone up and out. They're up there now. Deep personalization. So this is where you don't feel like the story that you're telling is your story, right? What happened to you. This is, people literally pull the Ganymede when something bad is going on, right? If so many people who've experienced sexual trauma will report, watching it from the ceiling and looking down because it was so overwhelming to be present. So it's sort of depersonalize it. Or they might derealize it, which is to say it doesn't feel real. Like it feels like it just feels like a story I'm making up, right? People often describe their trauma or their trauma feelings. Like maybe they know the story happened, but they think their feelings are just silly or ridiculous. We'll come back to the time travel stuff. Freeze and startle often predominates in Aquarius. Flashback. So a flashback looks like that you have this implicit material. And see, this is where Uranus is both traumatizing but also healing, because at some point you had that process and you split it off, but then later in life it gets re-triggered, right? Something happens, because none of those split off parts are just hanging out there neutrally. They all want back in. And they're waiting for things in your life that are going to like remind you, so that they can force their way back in. And they come back in, and they do that suddenly. And this is where Uranus opens the system, and maybe now one can incorporate and make use of that, right? Maybe now you have the sufficient ego structure to actually incorporate what couldn't be incorporated then, right? And this is hugely like some of our major Uranus points, like 21, 42, of course the others too, but particularly like the 42 one, where we have the Uranus opposition, right? And we often think of that as a time where a person's notion of who they are undertakes a radical transformation, right? It can be a midlife crisis, which would be where they are really unprepared to integrate what's asking to come in and what's interrupting. Or it could be a midlife passage, right? Where they do have the resources to do that, and they can expand their experience of who they are and who they're allowed to be. But either way, these Uranian transits and points are really introducing interruption. And the question is, will it be traumatically or non-traumatically mediated? Automatic obedience, that automaton-like quality. We know hypnosis, for instance, is very associated. I almost started going back and forth. I don't need to do that. But, you know, we know that Uranus is very associated to hypnotic states and trance, right? People who've been traumatized are usually very hypnotizable, which again could be of benefit, because if you can use that to open yourself to suggestion, which is benevolent, then you can actually transform your relationship to the trauma. On the other hand, you're also vulnerable to hypnosis of the culture, you know, hypnotized easily into obedience to whatever is expected of you. Or, of course, you know, sociopathic levels of hypnosis, which I've also encountered a lot with abuse victims. Rapid switches in self states. So in other words, 1 minute I'm this way, the next minute I'm that way, right? I'm Tros most of the time, and then all of a sudden I'm Ganymede. I'm mostly down to the earth. I mean, and I see this a lot in Aquarius, you know, that people with strong Aquarius are actually, you know, in the statistics world, I have always heard a lot of research of Aquarians being, you know, very high achievers, you know, presidents and CEOs and all this kind of stuff, academics, all of that kind of thing. And I think that's a lot of the Tros with, you know, these occasional Ganymede strokes of brilliance. But there is a rapid switch that happens back and forth with trauma, where you were one, now you're the other. A difficulty with experiencing connection with others when you're in a post-traumatic process. And of course, the very famous Aquarian tendencies of abstraction and intellectualization, because of an unwillingness to feel. The feeling function is offline to some extent because it's dangerous, right? If part of why dissociation is going on is sort of like what we talk about of Aquarius splitting things into fragments. Then what that also means is that you really get into lockdown, right? You want to be Tros with those horses because you don't want to feel your stuff, because you never know. If you feel one part, you don't know where it's going to link to next. There's this great psychoanalytic concept of attacks on linking. The notion of it is, anytime someone tries to link your feelings with your words, or your body sensations with your feelings, or your imagery with your thoughts, anytime we try to make links, a person who has a lot of trauma will always cut the link. They'll undermine the notion of it, because you never know what's going to link next, right? When you open to the Uranian implicit field, it is unpredictable as to what will come in, right? You don't get to know in advance. And so there's a tendency when we're very Saturn identified to say, no way I'm doing that. Like I'm going to stay in this contained world. So this sets up characterological stuff. So characterology to me means ego structure. So here we're talking about when Uranus and Aquarius are configured to the nodal axis, particularly the south node. Well, actually only the south node from my perspective and the EA perspective. Also the lunar, you know, configurations to the moon. Then we might see, or just major like stelliums in Aquarius or the 11th house. When we see Aquarius figuring on the ego structure material, right? So anytime the Aquarius 11 Uranus archetype is coming into dialogue with the nodes or with the fourth house Cancer moon zone, so any combos that do that, and or just a very big Uranian or Aquarian signature, or maybe Uranus on the angles, then we might start to think of Aquarian process as not just being processed, but it actually becomes almost structural. That's how I look at personality, right? It's just a set of processes that are iterated and iterated until the point that they seem like structure. Of course, nothing's really structure. I mean, nothing, 99.999% of matter is energy. So it's all pretend, but it begins to seem structural, right? It starts to seem like, and it's a useful distinction, this character structure. So dissociatively organized. So the person is dissociatively organized. What I mean is, whereas you might be narcissistically organized or histrionically organized or schizoid organized, whatever. Here, it's the dissociation itself that organizes how I move in the world. It organizes my personality, for lack of a better word. It's all about splitting off innocence from experience. And you might identify with one or you might alternate. On the one hand, the Tros or Saturn aspect, which is mortal and incarnated. It's dutiful, hardworking, capable of extreme achievement. It's not very youthful. It doesn't have a lot of change. It's not very flexible. Joy, spirituality, passion seem to be gone from that. I mean, when you meet people who have really been through it trauma-wise, they often appear dead and drained of any energy, of any life force, right? It's frequently, you can feel the stop in the room, right? That's how I often know there's trauma. It's just, I feel the stop. I feel that there's a lack of life force. Where did that thing go? Where is that person? And you realize later that Zeus came and got them. Avoidant of contact with others, as said, or with the unconscious, with the horses. Anti-erotic. There's no eros in the room when Tros is around. And by eros, I do mean sexual energy for sure, but I also just mean life force. And you could think of Saturn, who, who's one of these rulers, who castrated Uranus, right? Uranus actually, his testicles are the beginning of Venus. So there's a lot of eros actually in Uranian energy. There's potential eros, right? But Saturn sought to castrate Uranus. There's a lockstep and rigidly linear quality, and the time orientation is to the past here. Whereas in the Ganymede identification, and some people are more identified with Ganymede when they're running Aquarian process, endless potential, but none are chosen, right? So they keep seeing these big ideas, or they keep seeing, spiritual possibility. They're often in the spiritual bypass mode, and they reject almost anything that takes form. So as soon as it comes time to limit yourself, right? When you come into form, you have limited what is possible, right? We're in a world of duality in terms of the felt experience. Of course, not really duality, but in order to do what we do on this plane, it has to be in duality. So you're immediately limited when you choose to be human, right? And these people have a reluctance to that. It's like 1 foot in and 1 foot out of being incarnate. Preferring idealized worlds, past, future, idiosyncratic or disjunctive realities. I mean, idiosyncratic is just, their own little world. You know how Aquarians can have a whole thing about the world, conspiracy logics, all that kind of stuff. Or disjunctive realities, by which I mean just, really abroad of how anybody else can see things. At extremes, the slave of the gods, disconnected from other humans. So I think this one's really important. Ganymede is not really very free up there. I mean, he's basically the cupbearer to the gods. He's not really free. And he's kind of on automatic, right? Which is, again, what we see in trauma is that people are in loops that just keep repeating, right? They just keep on doing the same thing. Like often the dreams of trauma survivors, like I can think of one like where I'm on a Ferris wheel and it's out over the water and I keep wanting off, but it keeps going around and around and around, right? And I'm sitting in the chair with my abusive parent and we're just around and around and around. It's like this repetitive looping thing. There's often an innocent, naive, undeveloped, or immature quality, right? This is the puer or the puella, the eternal boy, eternal girl. They've not grown up because they haven't exposed themselves to life or this aspect to life. Contact dependent on a shared reality system. So if you don't see things the way they see things, you don't get to connect because they don't want interruption. And the time orientation now is going future-wise, right? They're looking ahead, looking to what could be, what might be. You know, they'll never get in a relationship because they're always waiting for the perfect person. So they can't take risks and go to a limited experience of relationship. They're waiting for whoever's out there. Some of my sex addicts that I work with, it's like the pornography orientation, right? They never really try a relationship with a human because it would activate too much implicit material. They stay in a relationship to the idealized notion. Schizoid, schizotypal, avoidant stuff. So I apologize for the clinical language, but these are kind of useful sometimes. These all are about withdrawing and often creating one's own little world. And then I think usually in Aquarian process, the father looms large. I mean, mother is always getting mothers are always being blamed for everything, that ever goes wrong in the world that I am somewhat heir to, which is psychoanalytic. But father is very implicated here. And you can see this is actually a myth of two fathers. It's very interesting. A lot of times, Aquarius process will lead to a person having like their original father, who's frequently a Tros-like figure, like, the dutiful father, or the guy who just was always at work and never had time for his kids. And then they meet a second figure later in life, who's often the more Zeus-like figure, who is this often happens with my gay male clients who, were frequently rejected by the father or didn't feel they had a place in the father's world. And then they go off and find another male who becomes almost like the second father. This is part of the logic of these sort of daddy-boy relationships that happen in the gay world, which are actually potentially quite healing and transformative and help a person access that Ganymede place and feel like it has, can come into the world. The question is, though, will you eventually also embody the Senex, or will you just be the eternal puer? So they might relate by being too obedient to the father, or by rejecting or destroying the father, which, Ganymede, you could say, rejected the father. Again, Ganymede doesn't exactly look unhappy to be being taken up there with Zeus. He actually looks kind of happy in most of the sculpture that you see. It doesn't feel like a bad thing happening. So I think I'm going to skip that for time. Okay. Actually, this is kind of an interesting part of the story. One thing to look at too is I just kind of thought about this at one point. Like, so as you know, as I said, he's the Prince of Troy. We're 3 generations before the war. And you might remember that Helen, the whole logic of her being abducted by Paris. So Helen is with the Greeks, and Paris, who's a Trojan prince 3 generations later, wants her, abducts her, and then that brings all of Troy down. And she was known as the most beautiful mortal at her time. So you can almost see here an intergenerational trauma lineage going on, right? Like, we lost our most beautiful one 3 generations ago, and now I'm going to go grab that back, right? I'm willing to bring the whole kingdom down to get it back. And a lot of times I see that with my, I can think immediately of addicts who often are, they've lost something innocent and pure about themselves, and they're seeking to retrieve that place. Like, for instance, with drugs to achieve altered transpersonal states, or with relationships to achieve certain types of connection that never happened. Like, something special has been lost and I want to get it. And I'm so willing to get it that I'll start a whole war, right? I'll do anything. And it becomes very self-destructive. And addiction so often follows on trauma. So it's very interesting to me to watch that story across those 3 generations, where we lost our most beautiful one and now we want to get it back, and we actually pull the whole thing down on ourselves. And we have the end of innocence again. And these are a couple of these. I was just kind of comparing in this image, like the rape, Ganymede's abduction, where again, I don't think he looks too unhappy. And then over here, Helen's abduction, where, she wasn't very unhappy at all. I mean, Venus had totally, charmed her. This is Paris, who was looking on at the 3 goddesses and picked Aphrodite, and then comes Helen. So I want to just touch on one more thing. I'm aware of the time, so the thing I want to touch on is time, because trauma is, and I haven't really gone much. Maybe we could do another one sometimes on the recovery from trauma, because I'm pretty much just spelling out this, you know, terrible world of split. But basically the recovery, I'm going to go back a bit. Recovery still looks like that, right? You basically don't have to do anything. The stuff will re-rupture. It's very funny, you know, in therapy, a lot of times, it's not funny, but often in therapy, there'll be ruptures between therapist and client. And I think they are actually where all the magic happens. Like, the therapist will fail to be the perfect empathic therapist. And this will happen in readings too. You'll fail to be that which the client wanted you to be. Like someone who tells them everything they're doing is perfect and it was everybody else who hurt them and it's all their other people's fault, for instance. So whatever you haven't been that they wanted you to be creates a rupture for them. And then the question is there now enough of a containing context that they can actually bring in the implicit material that was not integrated before, right? So that they come out of freeze, right? You thaw out and you come down from the sky and you move up from the earth, right? And you bring that together. And that's, to me, the astrology's potential. I mean, in astrology, we actually do what Zeus did, you know, in a way. We actually remind the client that they're not only Tros, right? We throw them into the sky. I mean, when you give somebody a chart, you're really putting them back in a much larger context. But the trick is that you don't want to just put them up there and remove them like happened to Ganymede. How are they going to still maintain their earthly life, right? Like we want to create that dialectic. But astrology ruled by Aquarius is going to naturally engage this myth in which, you know, we are Zeus-like in our ability to sort of seize the story of the client and place it in a bigger context, an immortal, timeless context. And yet we also have to come to terms, and they have to come to terms with life on Earth. Time is the thing I want to quickly do. So part of this is about that, how do we experience time? You know, Aquarius has always had an association with time travel. I always think of Doctor Strange and all those things with Aquarius. But we have to look, I think, time is interesting. And I didn't put Pisces on here, and I wish that I had. But we think about the movement from Saturn Capricorn time, which is so linear, sequential, unidirectional. It has a lockstep quality, right? Like past comes now, present's next, future's next, right? And you explicitly narrate it. And Saturn really shouldn't say memory there. It probably should say history, right? Like Saturn writes a particular history. As we know, history always it puts some parts of what actually happened out of the narrative. And that's what an ego needs to do. I put down there at the bottom, you know, the Cancer moon, you know, in order to have an ego, you have to have some sense of a personal history, which is explicit and narrativized. Like you can actually say, this is who I am and this is what's happened to me. Whereas the experience of time when Uranus comes into the picture becomes very nonlinear. It has a random quality. I don't actually think it's random, but it certainly appears random from a Capricorn perspective. It is multi-directional. Time is spatialized, right? Like instead of time being like a non-dimensional experience, it becomes a spatial field through which one can travel, right? Just like when you're in trauma, part of the problem with trauma is that it destabilizes the ego's existence. If you're very dissociatively organized, you don't have a strong ego at all, and you're so being battered between past and future, you're being battered across time, and you don't have that ability to be right here, right now. And so that can be the negative, but of course the positive is you actually can travel through time, right? You can actually, well, kind of like we do in some forms of energy medicine, we can actually, ride the wave of time, forwards and backwards. You can definitely do that with Uranus and Aquarius, but that does tend to be very destabilizing for Cancer and Moon. And then we could go to Pisces and talk about, whereas there's this interruptive quality in Uranian time, if we can go to Leo and have some coherence through the now, through the immediate present, right? Because Aquarius, media, in the media for sure, but mediation, Leo, immediate, right, is immediate. It's right here. If we go over to the Leo, then we can actually go back and evolve to that Pisces place, which is actually where we experience time as a eternal, timeless, everything at once, ultimate, all those things that we experience that way. Of course, if you don't integrate the Leo polarity there, if you just go Aquarius to Pisces, then you end up in a kind of regressive womb state that is, pretends to be everywhere and everything, but is actually just kind of a dissociation. You know, like dissociation is definitely a Pisces word too, right? Like, you know, Aquarian dissociation has a shock quality, like a, you know, like you can probably just feel when I did that, right? The energy just backs up behind me and I got to get that back in. I'm a little too vulnerable to that. But Pisces dissociation is much more like, huh? You know, it's very floaty, you know, right? It's like, and I think that's what happens when Aquarius doesn't integrate Leo, then you're likely to move into a Pisces that's very like adrift, not a transcendent Pisces that is in touch with ultimate reality, but you're going to get that other one. So I think that's what I had to say in this rather accelerated thing. I'm just going back and looking at these to see. I think I'll leave that one up because I think it's so beautiful. Partly because it tells us something about archetypal realities, that it says to us that, you know, the archetypes move through us and help us evolve, but we also feed them, right? Like we give the archetypal realities a chance to express here on Earth. Or from a soul perspective, each little ego, each little imperfect person that bothers me every day, you know, each little limited person, though, does assist this larger soul to evolve across time, right? It feeds the soul's journey. And that's another way you could look at this myth. You know, I'm kind of looking at the shadowy side of the myth, but it's an awfully beautiful myth for looking at how we bridge the worlds of spirit and form, right? Like he's the water bearer in our world. So he's actually pouring the sky back down. Like there's something about that link that Aquarian process can open up. And mediate the unmediatable, metabolize the unmetabolizable. So I've not left much time for questions because I really have a hard stop in about 5 minutes. But for 5 minutes, I'm definitely willing to do that. And also I totally welcome if you want to be in touch with me, you know, through email or that kind of thing. That's always welcome by me. So I think maybe Linda can free you from your muted states, or I don't know, you know, we can undissociate the parts of this conversation, I guess.
Yes, I'm so impressed by this lecture. I always have thought that the part of the people that have strong Uranus or a lot of trauma, I always thought that if they were more Saturnian, it was because your Aquarius is ruled both by Uranus and Saturn. I have never seen anything like this presentation where it's so explicit that, you know, they go toward a Saturnian response. I mean, I totally understand the whole concept. I have Sun Uranus in Cancer in the first house, square the node, square Mars.
Wow.
I totally agree with what you are saying.
Oh, great.
The thing that I didn't get was the authenticity, you know, like that the sun is, you know, when you put the division between the sun and Leo and Uranus and the participant and the observer, I mean, we all, you know, I think it all makes sense. But I was expecting to see the word authenticity for the Leo.
Oh, yeah. I would put authenticity there for sure. Right. Bringing one's authentic self into the world. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm right there with you. Yeah. I definitely would say that.
Yeah. Okay. Also, like you didn't talk a lot about the disconnection that when people have strong Uranus, that they very often are, you know, like I always have said that we are already part of the age of Aquarius because we see so many people that are on their phone and texting and that they are disconnected from the reality and they are in the technical world, you know?
Yeah.
So you didn't talk about that neither.
No, I didn't. You're right. I mean, I think because we are in the linear time thing, I'm a little cut short on these things, but I'm right there with you. Again, I think that that there is a fragmentation and a tendency. Oh, excuse me. When we look at the cyber world, you know, it has a fragmenting quality, and it has a very mental, it's almost all through words or decontextualized images. And so it does have that fragmenting quality. And yet I'm also aware that it's actually exactly what's allowing you and me to have this conversation, you know. So it's, again, how Uranus can be wounding in its fragmentation, but also when it interrupts space-time realities, right? So that's what we've interrupted the space-time continuum by having this conversation. And in that way, it's actually allowing us to reclaim and bring in more material together and make more connections. So I think it's this interesting double piece that it all seems to depend on whether we have a sufficient container to integrate it and make use of it, right? So we know that some people, when they're texting wildly on their phones and ignoring the person sitting across from them, we know that they don't integrate that. It's just endless fragmentation. But at the same time, here we are in a fairly coherent situation with, thanks be to Linda and others, right, where we can actually do this. So I'm with you, though. I think there's much to say about media and cyberspace, but it's that collapsing of time and space that Aquarius is good at. Yeah.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thanks for what you added to that. And I'm very sorry to be unable to continue talking right now, but I really am restricted by time. So I think I need to wrap up. Sorry?
I said I will contact you.
Okay. So thank you, everyone, for giving me the opportunity to be part of the conversation, and I'm looking forward to more. And again, I definitely welcome ongoing conversation in whatever forum. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jason.
Bye.
Thank you.
It
was wonderful.
It's awesome.
Great. Thank you. Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Unfortunately, Linda got knocked off the connection, so I think we just all need to hang up.